You open up like almost any elementary school history book, and you're going to find the exact same inspirational image.
Oh, for sure. The classic one.
Right. It's the story of a little girl, deaf and blind, standing at a water pump, and her teacher is spelling a word into her hand, and suddenly, the lights come on. It's a miracle.
Yeah, it's safe, it's heartwarming, it's universally beloved.
Exactly. But here is the jarring contradiction we really need to start with today. Because that exact same little girl at the water pump, she grew up to be a radical, card-carrying socialist.
Hmm?
She became an investigative champion for the working class, and her political activism was actually so fiercely controversial that she ended up being tracked on an FBI watch list.
Which is just wild to think about. I mean,
Yeah.
the gap between the symbol we've been sold and the actual human being who lived it's staggering.
It really is.
We're handed this perfectly neat narrative of, triumph over adversity.
Yeah.
But all the jagged edges of her actual adult life have been just completely smoothed over.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We are taking the source material on Helen Keller, and we are going to shatter that one-dimensional myth of the quote-unquote miracle child.
Yes. Time to break the myth.
Because the accepted history of Helen Keller is basically just a sanitized movie poster. It's cropped, it's color-corrected to make everyone comfortable. But today, we're giving you the gritty, unedited director's cut. We're uncovering the complex, fiercely independent, and frankly, controversial woman she actually was.
I love that. And to appreciate the sheer scale of how she eventually challenged the entire world, we really first have to explore the mechanics of how she learned to communicate with it in the first place.
Right. Let's go back to the beginning. So the year's 1880, and we are in Tuscumbia, Alabama.
Deep South.
Yeah. The Keller family lived on a homestead called Ivy Green, and the context of her family is incredibly important to understanding her later rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
Because before the American Civil War, her family was actually part of the slaveholding elite. Yeah. Her father had been a captain in the Confederate Army, and her maternal grandfather was a Confederate general. So she is born into this world of former Southern aristocracy that had lost a massive amount of its wealth and status.
Right. And for the first year and a half of her life, she was a typical hearing and seeing child. But at 19 months old, she contracted this unknown illness.
Do we know what it was?
Well, doctors at the time described it as an acute congestion of the stomach and the brain.
Oh, wow. That sounds intense.
It was. Modern medical historians suspect it could have been meningitis or, perhaps rubella or scarlet fever. She survived, but it left her permanently blind and deaf.
Which, she later described that state as being like a ship at sea in a dense fog.
It's a terrifying image.
Right. Try to put yourself in that position for a moment. You are a toddler, and suddenly all light and all sound simply vanish. I mean, the isolation must have been absolute terror.
Yeah, complete sensory deprivation.
But even then, you see this unbelievable resilience. Like, before she ever had formal training, by the age of 7, she had already developed over 60 home signs.
Really?
60? Yeah. She was communicating with the family cook's daughter, Martha Washington, and she could even distinguish different people coming into a room just by feeling the vibration of their footsteps on the floorboards.
See, that shows the intellect was always there.
Yeah.
Trapped inside, desperately trying to map its environment.
Exactly.
So the major turning point comes in 1886. Her mother reads an account by Charles Dickens, of all people.
Wait, Charles Dickens?
Yeah. He wrote about the successful education of another deaf and blind woman named Laura Bridgman. And this sets off a complete chain reaction. They consult doctors. They eventually get referred to Alexander Graham Bell.
The telephone guy.
The telephone guy, yes. He was heavily involved in working with deaf children at the time, and he points them to the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston.
And that recommendation is what leads to the arrival of Anne Sullivan on March 5th, 1887.
A huge day.
Helen later called it her soul's birthday. But, looking at the sources, it sounds like those early days were anything but a celebration.
Oh, it was a brutal clash of wills. Anne Sullivan was 20 years old, visually impaired herself, and an alumna of the Perkins Institute. And she just immediately starts trying to teach Helen by spelling words into her hand.
Just jumping right in.
Right. She starts with D-O-L-L for a doll she had brought her as a gift. But Helen couldn't comprehend that every physical object in the world had a specific corresponding word attached to it.
Because why would she?
Exactly. The frustration was immense. At one point, Sullivan is trying to teach her the word for mug, And Helen gets so frustrated she physically shatters the mug on the floor.
She said she was just making her fingers go in monkey-like imitation, like she didn't know words existed as a concept at all.
Right, it was just a physical game to her.
But then comes the water pump. This is April of 1887. Sullivan is running cool water over one of Helen's hands and tracing the letters W-A-T-E-R into her other palm.
And that is when it clicks.
Yeah. Helen wrote that she felt a misty consciousness of something forgotten, and suddenly the mystery of language was just revealed to her.
The living word awakened her soul, as she put it, and she immediately demanded to know the names of everything else around her. I mean, she completely exhausted Anne Sullivan that first day, just dragging her from object to object.
Okay, but here's where I really need to stop and ask about the mechanics of this, because this is where the popular myth usually stops, but the reality is so much more complex.
Oh, absolutely.
It's one thing to make a leap from a hand sign to a physical object, right? Like water or a pump or a doll. You can touch those.
Yeah.
But how does someone make the leap from a physical noun to abstract concepts?
It's a massive cognitive leap.
Right. How do you teach a deafblind child the concept of justice or love or irony? And further than that, how does that person go on to write 14 books and graduate from a mainstream college?
Yeah, it speaks to an absolutely ferocious intellectual drive. To teach abstract concepts, Anne Sullivan had to rely entirely on Helen's internal emotional states. Well, for example, to teach the word think, Sullivan waited until Helen was trying to string beads in this really complex pattern.
Okay.
And Helen got confused, and she sat there puzzling over it, concentrating really hard. In that exact moment of intense mental focus, Sullivan tapped the word T-H-I-N-K onto Helen's forehead.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she was mapping the vocabulary directly onto the physical sensation of a cognitive or emotional state.
So she was bridging the gap between an invisible internal feeling and external language. That is brilliant.
It really is.
But what about the reading and the writing? Because, I mean, she wrote 14 books.
Well, she didn't just stop at fingerspelling. She learned Braille, obviously. But she was determined to communicate as conventionally as possible with the hearing and seeing world. So she learned the Tadoma method.
I read about this in the sources, and the mechanics of it are just mind-blowing.
It really is unbelievable. It involves Helen placing her thumb on the speaker's lips and her fingers along their jawline and throat.
She's just feeling the voice.
Exactly. She was literally feeling the vibrations of their vocal cords, the movement of their lips, and the expelled breath to, quote-unquote, hear what they were saying.
It's like she was reading the physical instruments of a human voice the way someone might read dynamic, moving Braille.
That's a great way to put it.
And she used specialized Braille typewriters and even standard typewriters to write her books. She would have to compose and edit entire pages in her head because obviously she couldn't easily read back what she had just typed on a standard ink typewriter.
Right. The working memory required for that is just staggering. And that sheer mental processing power is what took her all the way to Radcliffe College at Harvard University.
Right, and she had some pretty famous fans backing her, too.
Oh, yeah. She had admirers like Mark Twain, who was just blown away by her intellect. Twain actually introduced her to Henry Huddleston Rogers, a Standard Oil magnate.
So big money.
Huge money. He and his wife were so impressed they funded her entire education. And in 1904, at age 24, she became the first deaf-blind person in the United States to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree.
So her education finally gave her a voice.
Yes.
But, and this is the pivot point for her whole story, because what she ultimately chose to say with that voice completely shocked the society that had just spent years putting her on a pedestal.
It really did.
Think of her situation kind of like a beloved child star. You know how the public treats child stars? They want them to stay cute, innocent, and above all, quiet.
Oh, definitely. Don't cause trouble.
Right. But then that child grows up and starts speaking out on deeply controversial systemic issues. The public desperately wanted Helen Keller to just be the smiling, inspirational miracle child, but she utterly refused to play that part.
Because her education didn't just teach her vocabulary, it taught her how to critically analyze the world. And when she analyzed the world, she became a radical activist.
And we are talking radical for the time.
Very. This wasn't polite, safe charity work. In 1909, she joined the Socialist Party of America. In 1912, she joined the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies. She became a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Hold on, let me interrupt you there. The Wobblies.
Yeah.
The Industrial Workers of the World were considered militant, dangerous radicals at the time. Why did she gravitate towards such extreme anti-capitalist groups instead of sticking to standard socially acceptable charity work for the blind?
Because she was looking for the root cause. She had been appointed to a commission to investigate the conditions of the blind, and she had a core revelation.
Oh.
She realized that much of the blindness and deafness in the world wasn't just random natural misfortune. It was a direct result of industrial greed and systemic poverty.
So she was looking at the actual data.
Yes.
Yeah.
She looked at unsafe working conditions in factories causing severe injuries. She looked at systemic poverty, preventing access to medical care. She even publicly pointed out that poverty drove women into prostitution, which led to syphilis. And untreated syphilis was a leading cause of blindness in infants at the time.
Wow. She went there.
She absolutely went there. And just to be clear, we are simply reporting the historical facts of her affiliations and arguments here. But her stance was that she didn't want to just offer charity to a blind worker. She wanted to dismantle the unregulated factory system that blinded him in the first place.
She was pulling the curtain back on the whole system.
Yep.
She basically told the wealthy elite, you are feeling pity for blind people, but your factories and your economic structures are the actual things blinding them.
Exactly.
Imagine how the media of the early 1900s reacted to their favorite inspirational mascot suddenly talking about class warfare and the economic roots of prostitution.
The hypocrisy of the backlash was staggering. The media turned on her almost overnight. There's this very famous example with the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle.
Oh, the story is wild.
It is. Before she came out as a socialist, this editor had met her and praised her intelligence and her courage to the skies. But the moment she started writing essays on socialism, his tune completely changed.
Of course it did.
Suddenly, he wrote that her political mistakes were due to the manifest limitations of her development.
Unbelievable.
He essentially told his readers, well, she's blind and deaf, so she doesn't actually understand what she's talking about.
Think about how infuriating that would be. To fight that hard for an education, to graduate from Radcliffe only to have your physical disabilities weaponized against you the exact second you challenge the status quo.
Right. But her clapback to that editor is legendary.
Oh, she destroyed him.
She did. She responded to him publicly, reminding everyone how generously he complimented her intellect before he knew her politics. She wrote, "Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle. Socially blind and deaf, it defends an intolerable system, a system that is the cause of much of the physical blindness and deafness which we are trying to prevent."
I mean, what a mic drop. She takes the very disabilities he used to dismiss her, and she turns them into a razor-sharp metaphor for his own willful ignorance.
She was incredibly effective as an advocate, which naturally made her dangerous to the establishment. So dangerous, in fact, that her activism caught the attention of J. Edgar Hoover.
Wait, really?
Yes, she was actually placed on an FBI watch list.
The little girl from the water pump had an FBI file.
A thick one, yeah. They monitored her associations, her ties to known communists, her support for the NAACP, and her travels.
That is just wild. But, this fierce rebellion against expectations wasn't just happening on the political stage.
No, it wasn't.
It spilled over into her personal life, leading to some incredibly surprising passions, thwarted romances, and honestly, some deeply uncomfortable contradictions. We really need to talk about the elopement because almost nobody knows this story.
Yeah, this is a fascinating chapter. So when Helen was in her 30s, Anne Sullivan fell ill and had to go away to recover. And a young Boston Herald reporter named Peter Fagan, who was actually known as the finger-spelling socialist.
Great nickname.
Right. He was sent to act as her private secretary. And as they worked closely together, they fell in love. He learned to communicate with her seamlessly, and they became secretly engaged.
And I was reading this in the sources, hoping for a happy ending, But she fully intended to elope with him, and she never got the chance.
No.
She defied her family, she defied her teacher, and she tried to run away with the man she loved. But her family found out and fiercely intervened.
Awful.
They physically thwarted the elopement, they intercepted the plans, and she never married. They just couldn't accept the agency of a deafblind woman making that kind of independent, romantic, and sexual choice.
It really highlights a tragic tension in her life. She was a global advocate for human freedom, yet her own personal freedoms were heavily policed by the people closest to her.
Yeah.
But, if we are looking at the unedited director's cut of her life, we also have to address the areas where her own views policed others in very, very dark ways.
Yeah, I really struggled with this part of the source material. It is incredibly jarring to hear a prominent disability rights advocate argue against saving impaired infants. How do we even begin to reconcile the woman who fought for the vulnerable with someone who actively supported eugenics?
It is deeply unsettling. And again, keeping our completely impartial lens here, the facts are that in 1915, She wrote in favor of refusing life-saving medical procedures to infants born with severe mental impairments or physical deformities.
Which is just shocking to read.
It is. She claimed their lives wouldn't be worthwhile, and that they would likely become criminals. To even begin to understand this logically, we have to unpack what the mainstream eugenics movement actually believed at that specific time.
Right, because it wasn't a fringe theory back then, was it?
Not at all. It was driven by elite universities, and it was framed as progressive public health. The prevailing pseudoscience of the era taught that poverty, criminality, and severe disability were all directly inherited genetic traits. The eugenics movement convinced many prominent intellectuals that society could literally perfect the human race and eliminate all suffering by preventing the quote-unquote unfit from surviving or reproducing.
So in her mind, she genuinely believed she was advocating for a society free of suffering. But she was doing so using a framework that we now recognize as horrific and discriminatory.
Precisely.
I still struggle to process it, but it proves she wasn't a perfect, infallible marble statue. She was a deeply flawed product of her time, susceptible to the exact same dangerous ideologies as her contemporaries.
It's a sobering reminder that brilliant people can still hold massive blind spots.
Absolutely.
But when you look at the sheer weight of these intellectual burdens she carried,
Yeah.
the grueling global labor crusades, the dark pseudoscience she got tangled up in, the constant policing of her personal life by her family, you can understand why she might desperately seek out a connection that was entirely pure.
Something uncomplicated by politics or human agendas.
Exactly. Which brings us to a fascinating and much lighter chapter of her life, her profound bond with animals, specifically Akita dogs.
Yes, I loved this part.
So in 1937, she embarked on a tour of Japan. She was already highly revered there, and during her visit, she learned the story of Hachiku, the famously loyal dog who waited at a train station for his deceased master every day for a decade.
We all know the movie, yeah.
Right. And she was so moved by the sheer uncomplicated loyalty of the story that she asked about the breed.
And the Japanese government actually presented her with an Akita named Kamikaze Go.
Which is amazing.
She literally became the very first person to bring the Akita breed to America. Tragically, Kamikaze Go died of an infection shortly after arriving in the States, but the Japanese government sent her his brother, Kenzan Go, whom she nicknamed Go-Go.
Go-Go, that's adorable.
And she absolutely adored these dogs. The sources say Go-Go even slept at the foot of her bed on his first night in her home.
It's such a beautiful detail because it shows her capacity for joy and visceral connection outside of her massive public crusades. And connection really is the defining feature of her entire life. Because even with her towering intellect, Helen Keller's life was never lived in a vacuum. It was sustained by a continuous chain of intense, lifelong partnerships.
Right, let's focus on those companions as we look at her later years. Because it wasn't just Anne Sullivan, though Sullivan was with her for nearly 50 years.
Yeah, Anne Sullivan was the pioneer. She was one who first broke through the dark. When Sullivan died in 1936, it's incredibly poignant. She passed away with Helen sitting right beside her, holding her hand.
Wow.
But Keller's work didn't stop. Before Sullivan's death, a young woman from Scotland named Polly Thompson had been hired. Thompson initially had zero experience with deaf or blind people. She was just hired to keep house.
Just a housekeeper.
Yep. But she eventually learned to communicate, became a secretary, and then stepped up as Keller's constant companion for decades, traveling the globe with her. And after Thompson passed away, a nurse named Winnie Corbally stepped in for the remainder of Keller's life.
And when you look at the sheer scale of her legacy, the ground she covered with the help of those companions is just breathtaking.
Truly.
She traveled to dozens of countries, over 35 countries between 1946 and 1957 alone. She gave motivational speeches, she raised massive funds for the American Foundation for the Blind, and she co-founded Helen Keller International to research vision, health, and nutrition globally.
And the people she met. She met every single U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson.
That's a huge span of history.
Right. Johnson actually awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. And of course, her early life was immortalized in The Miracle Worker, which started as a teleplay and became an Oscar-winning film starring Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke.
Though it is a devastating footnote to history that the actual physical archives of her work, which were owned by the American Foundation for the Blind, were stored away in New York and were lost when the Twin Towers were destroyed in the September 11th attacks.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking.
It is. So much of the physical record of her extraordinary life was just obliterated in a single morning.
Which really makes it all the more urgent that we actively remember and tell her full, unedited story today.
Definitely. Looking at all of this, the theme that really anchors her story for me is interdependence.
How so?
Well, it's such a profound paradox. You have this woman who changed the world, who fought relentlessly for systemic independence and human rights, but she literally navigated that physical world with someone else's hand in hers.
Wow. Yeah.
It proves that needing help, relying on a companion or a teacher, doesn't diminish your agency or your power.
And that brings us right back to why understanding the real Helen Keller matters so much for you, listening right now. When we reduce historical figures to simple, inspirational childhood anecdotes, we rob them of their humanity. We strip away their agency, their intellect, and their actual beliefs.
We turn them into something safe and comfortable so we don't have to engage with what they were actually demanding of us.
Exactly. Helen Keller wasn't just a symbol of overcoming personal physical adversity. She was a brilliant, radical, flawed, and tireless fighter who looked at the fundamental structures of the world, the economics, the labor laws, the civil rights, and demanded that they change.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. We've just spent this time taking the accepted elementary school version of Helen Keller and turning it completely upside down.
Yeah, completely.
If the inspirational little girl at the water pump was actually a fierce, controversial radical who terrified the FBI, what other heavily sanitized historical figures have we completely misunderstood? Whose accepted history should you be questioning next?